Let's talk about narcissistic channeling. Ooh. This can feel a bit horror filmy. It came up a while back when I was chatting with someone who told me about a family reunion. And one of the people at the family reunion, so follow this story, okay? One of the people at the family reunion was the woman's niece, whom she had never met. And this niece was the daughter of this woman's sister. And this woman had stopped talking to her sister years ago, and then the sister died. The woman told me that her sister was a malignant, vulnerable, narcissistic person, had like a grifter vibe to her. She took financial advantage of multiple financially vulnerable family members and she's taken financial advantage of other people. She'd future fake the hell out of everyone. She'd get into relationships with men and financially take advantage of them and shake them down. And she was a triangulating and very cruel within the family system. And she said her sister had been like that since they were kids. The woman I was talking to said that when she found out that her sister had grifted $50,000 from a cousin who could not afford it, and it screwed up the cousin's life immeasurably. And yet their mother kept making excuses for this grifter sister. The lady said she went no contact with both her mother and her sister. She'd had it. Over the years, the sister lived with the mother and sort of took financial advantage of her, and they sort of fueled each other. And while a lot of the family guilted and shamed this woman for cutting off her mother and her sister, the woman said that her life and her health and her well-being improved significantly once she cut them off. She also knew that her sister had gone on to have a daughter whom she'd never met. And the daughter ended up being raised by the parents of the father of the child when she's around the age of 14, when the sister of this lady went to prison for a few months for some fraud thing. Okay, messy story. But the woman who I was talking to said she wasn't aware of any of this with the niece because she had cut off ties with her mother and her sister. And actually, as a result, a lot of the family she wasn't talking to, and she wasn't a social media person, so she didn't know. So now, in this woman's story, the mother and the sister are now dead. This family reunion invitation comes up, and the woman says, okay, someone's asking me to come. It's safe for me to show up to a family reunion. She was told about it by a cousin that by coincidence she ran into. There were some other cousins she wanted to see that were all grown up now and had their own children. And this woman herself that I was talking to was getting older. And she felt isolated and didn't have a place to belong and isolated from the family system because of the menace that was created by her mother and sister. And she told me, I didn't even register the whole niece thing, that this niece potentially could come. I sort of forgot about her. Well, the woman I was talking to shows up at the reunion, and then she said that her niece wandered over. And the woman said, it was eerie. I almost felt something unsettling in my gut. The niece looked quite a bit like her sister, but she thought, well, this young woman can't help that. It's her mother. As time went on, this woman was curious about her niece. You know, she wasn't blaming the niece for what her sister was like. She asked her what her life was like. The niece wasn't hostile or mean or anything like that. As they initially talked, the niece talked about her job and where she lived and a vacation she took somewhere. And interestingly, some of her mannerisms were a lot like the woman's sisters, which again, this woman said it made me uncomfortable after all these years to sort of see these mannerisms channeling through someone else. Now, this was an event that was lasting for a whole weekend, and she talked to the niece a bit through this first day of the event. Now, on the second day, the woman said a group was talking with the niece about something, and it was getting heated, some kind of lots of opinions floating around. The niece then got a bit worked up, and then it got even more heated, and the woman said it was like the strangest thing she'd ever seen. She said it was as though my niece was channeling my sister. The look in her eyes, the turn of a phrase, the way she stood, it was effed up. The woman said it was as though my sister was there or like coming out through her kid. And the lady said to me, she's like, it actually felt almost like horror film level stuff, like she was channeling her, and brought back enough bad memories to this woman that she ended up sort of saying her goodbyes, and she ended up leaving the reunion half a day early. So that's a long story, but it's to set the tone here of what I'm talking about. But have you ever had that happen? Someone who is somehow related or in proximity to the narcissistic person, maybe in your family, could even sometimes be in your workplace. We'll talk about that in a bit. But let's focus on the family first, who, when they show up, it feels as though they are literally channeling the narcissistic person. It could be a sibling who channels your narcissistic parent, a niece or nephew that channels your narcissistic sibling, like this lady, a family member that channels the narcissistic grandparent, and the person that they are channeling may have long since passed. And your body literally reacts to it. And frankly, the entire social group may change because it's as though the narcissistic person is there. So what's this about? Well, it's not really channeling, right? Part of this is just good old genetics and temperament and what we call social learning. The turn of a phrase, the sound of a laugh, our physicality, some of that is genetic and temperamental. And it does suck when we do have some of the quirks of a narcissistic parent ourselves. But that's sort of how temperament works. That's how genetics work. But that channeler, the person who's sort of the narcissistic channeler, may not just have some of those quirks, but they may also react in some of the ways that the narcissistic person that they're channeling did. The channeler is not always narcissistic, but in addition to genetics, there is another way this happens. And again, as I said, it's something we call social learning. We repeat the things we observe in other people, especially in relationships. People do things, we watch it enough, we learn it, right? The channeler may actually be someone you do get along with. But, for example, when the pressure is on the channeler, who knows? Something happens. They're getting called out on something. They feel that their back is against the wall. They feel defensive or trapped. We tend to go primal at those times. And what may be primally held for the channeler is all that stuff that they may not only genetically and temperamentally carry from the narcissistic person in the family, but also it is a series of protective and survival responses that person learned from observing the narcissistic person. Whatever this combination is, it feels like the narcissistic person is almost speaking through the channeler. Now, the channeler is often someone who doesn't fully get narcissism or didn't want to see it. They may have been an enabler of sorts or locked into cognitive dissonance or betrayal blindness. In another channeler story, a woman had said that her brother never wanted to register that their father was narcissistic all their lives, full into adulthood. And then as the father developed dementia, the brother was convinced that their father's behavior was just all old age and that his sister was being overreactive. The woman and her brother were twins and actually got along quite well. And the woman only learned about narcissism and just trying to understand some stuff she was going through when her father was already quite old. But her brother was not open to the idea that their father was narcissistic. And he would often write off their dad's difficult behavior to their dad just being difficult and having had a difficult childhood. And the twin brother had really lived his entire life trying to please his father, obviously to no avail. When the woman finally got it and was trying to come up with a better plan for their father, the twin brother would get increasingly angry. And then one day he blew up at her in such a way that she said it was as though my dad was right there in the room. If I closed my eyes, I would have thought it was my father's voice. And she said it freaked the hell out of her. The brother sort of fully channeled the father, and the sister was bummed out because the whole experience did unsettle her, and it unsettled her so much that she didn't feel as close to her brother. She said it was, again, she also used this sort of horror film analogy. It was as though he had the father demon inside of him that could pop out at any time. And this led to a lot of grief for this woman who really does love her brother, but now is a little bit more anxious around him. It took the intensity and the high demand of the father's situation and decision-making around it to bring this out in the brother. But after it happened, the sister was having a tough time unseeing it. So this channeling can be with people we feel we have perfectly fine relationships with. If you have your own children that you are co-parenting with a narcissistic person, this is where channeling can get dark. Because one day, one of those children may channel your narcissistic co-parent or narcissistic ex. And when this happens to the parents of adult children that they raised with a narcissistic co-parent, hell, they don't even need to be adult children. And whether or not you split up with the co-parent or not, people will say it can sometimes feel as though they're having to live it again. And will say that not only is it very unsettling, it almost feels re-traumatizing to have their child, middle school child, adolescent child, even adult child, use the same phrases and tone and tactics as their narcissistic ex-partner. But that they felt a tremendous grief because they didn't feel as safe with their own child anymore. It was as though it was their greatest fear come to life. And there was also tons of self-blame, with people having regret around whatever choices that they made, whether they stayed or left the relationship. They always wondered if the other path would have meant that their child wasn't like this. This is not unusual for a child. Even a child who has witnessed and registered all the harmful behavior of the narcissistic parent. It's not unusual for the child to maintain their ongoing alliance and even allegiance to the narcissistic parent. And this could be many things. It could be a safety behavior. It could be an acting out behavior. It could be a rebellious behavior. It could be just plain old-fashioned trauma bonding. And when that happens, the child is more likely to pick up and retain more of the responses and tone and way of being of that narcissistic parent. It's one of the greatest sorrows of folks who've raised children with narcissistic co-parents, and it feels deeply unfair. I'm using this term channeling because that's what it feels like to people, as though someone who is not the narcissistic person in your life, whom you think you have a fine enough relationship with, starts sort of being and talking in the ways that the narcissistic person does from time to time. Again, the only example I can think of is these scary movies, which I can't even bear to watch, when you have the nice character and then they get scary looking and speak in that devilly voice, like in Poltergeist or Stranger Things or The Exorcist. You get the idea. It's like regular person and it's like, wow, they make that sort of terrifying devil talk noise. Because most people who went through these channeling experiences say, it's not like I stopped loving this person who sort of channeled our parent, but I kind of got a little scared of them. Like the narcissistic person actually was in them, which obviously isn't true. But the channeling experiences can be very triggering and unsettling and bring up feelings that leave you feeling unsafe and frankly out of your body. What is true is that we learn what we see. And then when you pepper this temperament piece in there, under specific conditions, those reactions that this channeler in your life was exposed to, that all of you in a system were exposed to, the tactics are mirrored, and it's not pretty. Now, is it possible that do all of us do a little channeling if we had narcissistic parents? Yeah, probably yes. We may find ourselves getting testy in ways that afterwards we feel ashamed of, or even a full-blown sense of moral injury about. We may find ourselves being a little gaslighty when we are trapped. And this is why self-awareness and self-reflection and self-compassion all become so important. So we can slowly exercise, and I don't mean exercise, I mean like demon exorcise, these internalized patterns, but also be kind to ourselves when it does pop with a goal of being more aware of making amends. People who are more profound channelers often do that, and also may be in denial about the narcissistic people that were in your lives. For example, your adult child who feels like they are channeling your narcissistic ex may be very resistant to seeing their parents' narcissism. Or the sibling who's able to channel your long dead narcissistic parent may never have been willing to see how toxic that parent was. And that resistance can also mean that the narcissistic channeling and defenses that come out in them are going to be that much more resistant to change. Life feels like enough of a scary movie when we are in these relationships. But when we sort of witness or experience this phenomenon of channeling, for lack of a better term, you definitely want to hit the pause button on these movies. And then there's another piece to remember. In a strange way, channeling can sometimes feel like, especially if the narcissistic person is passed, we often see this with parents, it's almost like it keeps it alive. And it can make the grief process even more complicated. It could be that the leadership structure in a company changes, and yet some people continue to hold sort of like the ways of being of the former leader. While non-relational, like there's no relationship with somebody, they didn't grow up with someone, that kind of in the workplace channeling doesn't feel as profound. You can definitely see how somebody kind of takes on that turn of a phrase and almost seems like, oh my gosh, like it's like, why did we get a new boss? Because this one sounds like the old one, and may very well have learned from the old one. So this can show up, and like I said, it's the horror movie that you want to press that pause button on, but when it happens, you might think like, woo, that felt really weird and really eerie. Yeah, it did. And it can really unsettle you. So as always, ground yourself, bring yourself back down. It doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship with this person has to be ended. It may, though it's important to know what this phenomenon can feel like, but also that to understand where it comes from, and that for certain members of a family, especially those in denial about it, it can definitely show up a lot more. Thanks again.